Interesting things, I think, to share with you. I think you'll learn a couple of new things about hyperbaric oxygen you might not have known before. You'll certainly hear some things you've never heard, so I would love to just have your attention while you guys eat and enjoy your meal. So I want to start this with a picture of my family. These are my children. The oldest is Levi with the blue vest, Wyatt with the white vest, and Kaya there in the middle. She's 2.5. So they're the reason I'm here. They're the reason I'm here, and that statement up there, have you guys heard this before? That today's children might be the first generation of children to not outlive their parents? Show of hands. Yeah. I mean, that's a tragedy. It breaks my heart to think that that could be true. Hold that thought for just a second. If I could guarantee you a quality of life, a very high quality of life for 100 years, show of hands if you'd love to see 100 years old. Most of us would. Let's just say instead of that, I could promise you about 65 years of quality, and then you're going to have a rapid decline over the next 30 or 35 years. Show of hands, how many still want to live to be 100? Of course, right? A few. But for the most part, what we're interested in is we're interested in quality of life. But what's really interesting here is that in America today, quality of life index peaks at around 65 to 68. At the same time, centenarians, Americans that are living to 100 years or beyond, are one of the largest growing populations in our country. In fact, we're reaching heights, some age heights that are more than in human history has ever seen. But our quality of life index is still peaking in our mid to late 60s, and then we're declining for the next 30 years. And what I want to share with you is that the reason I believe that our quality of life index is still stuck in the mid-60s is the exact same reason that my children's generation might be the first generation to not outlive their parents. And that's chronic illness. Chronic lifestyle illness. And as a result, as we age, we start to see pictures more like these. And what a crazy time to be in practice, at least for me and probably many of you, where I treat kids, I treat young adults, I treat older adults. And in my own practice and in my own family, I'm seeing my grandparents and my parents aging earlier physically than they are chronologically. And I'm faced with the fact that my children might not outlive me. And the worst part is that chronic illness, which I believe is the cause of that entire paradox, is preventable. Currently, 45% of Americans have at least one chronic illness across all age brackets. Of those 65 and older, most have 2 or more. But even according to the CDC, just some simple lifestyle changes like not smoking, exercising a little bit, and just eating a little bit cleaner has massive changes. In fact, somewhere between 75 to 90% of all chronic illness is preventable. 90% of type 2 diabetes, 80% of cardiovascular disease, 70% of most cancers, 70% of most strokes are all preventable. We're doing it to ourselves through our lifestyle, through chronic stress. So if we want our children, raise your hand, if we want our children to outlive us, if we want our quality of life index to start matching longevity, then we need to start dealing with this. We need to start looking at chronic illness as chronic stress, looking at it as a lifestyle disease, and teaching our patients how to deal with this in their lives. We need to become doctors of cause, not doctors of effects. And that's what this entire conference, that's what this entire weekend is about. And so I'm honored to be here to be a part of that and be able to share some of this information with you. I'm Dr. Jason Saunders. I have a practice in New Jersey, as Shannon said. We have a handful of docs that practice with us. We offer a variety of solutions to lifestyle disease. We offer functional neurology, functional medicine, chiropractic, massage, acupuncture, different nutritional supplements or diets. We also use full-body photobiomodulation. We also use hyperbaric oxygen. I've been using hyperbaric oxygen in our practice for about 11 years. It's an amazing tool. And that's what we're going to cover in a few moments. Very quickly, I'd like to discuss chronic illness a little bit deeper with you, because that piece is critical for understanding where hyperbaric oxygen fits in regenerative medicine. Then we'll talk a little bit more about hyperbaric itself, the mechanism behind it, how it works, why it works, what are some of the short and long-term benefits from being exposed to a hyperbaric environment for periods of time. We'll talk about different chambers that are out there so that you have an idea in case you're curious or you might want to incorporate it into your practice. Or if you were going to refer to patients out for it, what you should look for, what different clinics might offer so that you have an idea of where you want to direct your patients. And then lastly, we'll talk about where it fits into the model of longevity, regeneration, quality of life medicine. So as I said, chronic illness equals chronic stress. Chronic stress equals lifestyle conditions, lifestyle diseases. This is the conversation that I have with patients all the time. I want to share it with you as a way that maybe you could start to have a similar conversation with your patients. If you have a pen and you like to take notes, you might want to write some of this down. Stress is anything that causes a change inside of our body. That change could be positive or negative. A relatively new term coined, eustress. Is that familiar? Eustress? Eustress? Good. So, eustress is a positive stress. It's a stress that makes a change inside of our body, but as a result of being exposed to that stress, we heal. We get stronger. It improves our health. On the opposite side is a thing called distress. Distress is the stress that most of us think about when I use the term stress. And distress ultimately breaks us down. It makes us sicker. It's the cause of these issues that I was saying before. And what I'd like to offer you is the fact that your current health today, in this moment, is a direct relationship to how well you balance your positive stressors, your eustress, and your negative stressors, your distress. And when we start to understand it from that standpoint, we can start to look in our own lives, or help our patients look in their lives, of how they're balancing their stressors in their life, and where we need to intervene to help them out. So stress is anything that causes a change in our body. There's positive or negative changes, and they all come from one of three sources: physical stress, emotional stress, and chemical stress. Physical stress is everything we do to our bodies. Chemical stress is everything we put into our mouths or take into our body in some way. And emotional stress is everything that we think about. And what you can tell from that diagram is basically each one of them represents about a third of our total lifestyle stress, and they all interact with each other. And we see that in our lives. How many people exercise? Fabulous. If it's the right kind, the right amount, and the right intensity of exercise, we should assume that that's a eustress, that's good for you. As a result of doing that exercise, it's going to improve your health, improve your life. True or false? When you exercise, you also feel better emotionally. True or false? True, right? So they're interacting with each other. So you did something good for your physical being, and as a result, you felt better emotionally. And so understanding these interrelationships helps us explain this to patients and helps them create a plan in their life for how to incorporate this and make changes in their total levels of stress. This is in your notes. It's just a summary of that conversation. And so as a result of all this lifestyle stress, this is not an all-inclusive list, but these are the top conditions that we see in our office: heart disease, cancer, autism, dementia, ADD, ADHD, neurotransmitter imbalances. Is this familiar to you guys? Is this what you're seeing also? Of course. I mean, this is chronic illness in America. But what I want to say is that these are the effects This is how chronic stress and lifestyle stress is ultimately showing up in our lives. These are the effects of that. These are the causes. And this is where we need to start to intervene, I believe. And so not that every one of those conditions has every one of these causes, but what I think you could see if you look at the connection between each of these and compare it to the list of diseases that I was just showing, you'll see a lot of common patterns. And not that every condition has this, and not that it always goes in this exact order, but basically we have some level of tissue breakdown at some point. As a result of tissue breakdown, we start to get a decrease in blood flow. If we can't get the blood flow to an area, the tissue starts to not be able to get the fuel that it needs to survive and to function, and it can't get rid of all the waste products. If we can't get rid of the waste products, it starts to accumulate in our cells, and we get inflamed. And so we start to get GI inflammation and nervous system inflammation. We start to get metabolic dysregulation. We get leaky gut, we get leaky brain. And as a result of all this inflammation and immune system dysregulation, we get changes in our microbiome, which only further increases the total oxidative stress in our body. It sets off the inflammatory cascades, which ultimately then lead to DNA damage, epigenetic damage, and further tissue damage. And then the cycle continues. And how are we doing so far in America when it comes to chronic illness? Is heart disease going up, going down, or staying the same? Up. Cancer, up, down, or staying the same? Right? And so even with our best interventions thus far, traditionally, in the last 30 years, autoimmunity continues to rise, autism continues to rise, heart disease, stroke, diabetes, cancer, they're all rising. In fact, we spend the most money, the U.S. spends the most money in the world on healthcare, and yet last time I checked, I think we were 37th on the list of healthiest countries in the world. That's terrible. So what does this have to do with oxygen? Everything. Oxygen is a critical tool in your entire ability to regulate yourself. Every minute of every day, as you sit here listening to me talk, as I stand here speaking with you, oxygen is a critical nutrient that we need every minute of every day. We've all had a pulse oximeter on our finger. We do this with patients, yes? So everyone in here knows that we're about 98 to 100% oxygenated. Is that true? Familiar? Good. So what that means is basically all of our red blood cells are almost or at 100% oxygenated every minute of every day. And we need that level of oxygen just to sit here and talk to each other. 100% oxygenated. And so I look at oxygen like a nutrient. How long can you go without food? Anybody? Weeks? Days? We talk about fasting. Do you guys fast yourselves? Use fasting in your offices? Right? You can go weeks or months without food. You can only go a few days without water. But you can only go a few minutes without oxygen. And you need 100% saturation of oxygen every minute of every day. And so, as a vitamin, let's take vitamin C. If you don't get enough vitamin C, there's consequences to that. What's that called? Scurvy, exactly. So if you become deficient in vitamin C, you get a thing called scurvy. If you're getting enough vitamin C, you try to get an optimum range that basically delivers all the vitamin C we need in a given day to do all the functions that vitamin C does in our body. But periodically, we might choose to megadose vitamin C to help us out, right? If you had a cold, you might take an extraordinary amount of vitamin C for a few days to try to kick your immune system into gear, correct? Well, I look at oxygen just like that. If you don't get enough oxygen, that could be globally, like you have a respiratory illness so you're not getting enough oxygen, or it could be locally, like you had a trauma, an injury, a crush injury, or a stroke. So now all of a sudden, you're 100% oxygenated, but there's a tissue inside your body that's not getting enough oxygen. That area becomes hypoxic, The consequences of not getting enough oxygen is hypoxia. Likewise, we need a certain amount of oxygen every day for normal function. For us, that's 100% oxygenated. And then periodically, we might choose to mega-dose oxygen as an attempt to help heal certain tissue. The issue is this: if you're 100% oxygenated right now, just sitting here, how can we possibly ever get more? And the answer to that is hyperbaric oxygen. It's only under pressure that our bodies are actually able to absorb more oxygen than we can, because we're bypassing the red blood cell carrying capacity altogether. Oops, wrong button. So that process of oxygenation is governed by two laws. I'm sure you're familiar, you probably heard of them in chemistry class long ago, but Boyle's law and Henry's law. Boyle's law tells us that as we exert a pressure on a gas, we can make that gas take less space. Henry's law says as a result of all that pressure, we can now dissolve that gas into some kind of liquid. In terms of hyperbaric, what that means is we could take a lot of oxygen and we could smush it into a small space we call a hyperbaric oxygen chamber. And a result of being exposed to that increased amount of oxygen under pressure, we could dissolve that into your fluid. And what that means is into the plasma of your body. This just shows us that there's a treated group and a non-treated group, that those white boxes are basically the same, and that's our red blood cell carrying capacity. So we all have about 100% oxygenation available for us to absorb. The difference is in the HBOT, hyperbaric oxygen group, that hash box is much bigger than the non-treated group. And what that's showing is the increased arterial oxygen that person or that group was able to absorb because of the pressurized environment. Hyperbaric oxygen affects our tissues in 4 different ways. One, if we can dissolve more oxygen directly into the plasma of our blood, right away we're increasing how much oxygen our tissue can absorb. The second way is that when there's damage to a tissue, that could be an injury, a stroke, if there's damage to the capillaries, red blood cells cannot get to the tissue to deliver the oxygen. If you remember, red blood cells line up single file in the capillary, and that's where oxygen exchange occurs. So if those capillaries are damaged, those red blood cells can't get through. If those red blood cells can't get through, we can't deliver those nutrients. Under hyperbaric environments, we can, because although red blood cells can't get through, the plasma gets through. And now the plasma is saturated with oxygen, so as a result, we can now get oxygen to a tissue that was previously starving. The third way is angiogenesis. One of the long-term, which we'll talk about in a minute, one of the long-term benefits of being exposed to hyperbaric is an increase in blood supply. The body will literally build more capillaries in order to get the oxygen where it needs to go. And the fourth is through dissipation. And so to illustrate that, I'm going to show you a glass of seltzer. Right? When you pop open a can of seltzer, there's a pressure release, correct? That's a lot of carbon dioxide put into a small can. And when you open it, a lot releases right away. And then as you fill the glass and time goes by, that carbon dioxide slowly dissipates out of the glass. The same thing happens in our body in hyperbaric. When you leave the chamber, can you hear me? Sorry, it fell. There we go. Good. When you leave the hyperbaric chamber, initially there's a release of oxygen, and then as you're outside the chamber environment for a period of time, that oxygen continues to dissipate out of our tissue. What we now know is that that oxygen dissipation, it's not inert, it's not like it doesn't do anything, it actually does. And as it dissipates out of the circulation, it affects the tissue that it's passing through as it's leaving. And as a result, we're actually able to affect tissue 4 times further away from the capillary than we can during normal oxygen exchange in a normal capillary scenario. And that 4 times distance is very meaningful, especially in certain injuries. So what's out there? People, who has seen a hyperbaric chamber, been in a hyperbaric chamber? Any experience, a little bit? Okay. So a lot of people think hyperbaric chambers are this massive, huge steel machine. It costs hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. There are lots of different types of chambers now available, and different chambers for different people, for different conditions. It makes sense relative to what you might be using it for in your own office. So I want to talk about some of those differences. In a hospital setting, actually I'm going to simplify this whole thing. There's hard chambers and soft chambers. Okay? Hard chambers are capable of very high pressure. Soft chambers are capable of what's called mild hyperbaric, more mild pressure. So there's hard and there's soft. Some you're going to fill with 100% oxygen, and some you're going to fill just with air. So there's hard, there's soft, there's air-filled, and there's oxygen-filled. Okay? So in a hospital setting, you typically have hard chambers. The one on the right is a monoplace, right? So monoplace means one person goes in, multiplace means multiple people can go in. So you have monoplace and multiplace chambers. In the monoplace chamber, that chamber is being filled with 100% oxygen and capable of very high pressure. There are certain conditions that might require that. The one to the side is a multiplace chamber. That chamber is being filled with air, not oxygen, but you see them wearing a mask. And they're wearing that mask because they're pumping 100% oxygen through, so you can still breathe 100% oxygen under pressure without filling the chamber with 100% oxygen. Everybody follow? Then there's hard chambers, monoplace like this. This is one we have in our office, where we fill that with air. And you could, if you want, also pump oxygen in, kind of like that multiplace chamber does. Real quick, the magic in hyperbaric oxygen has a lot more to do with the pressure than it does with the oxygen. In other words, if you were sitting here now at 99% oxygenated and you breathe 100% oxygen, you'll go from 99 to 100, but you can't go beyond that, right? And so even with chambers that aren't pumping in oxygen, strictly air from the room, but you're filling it with pressure, we're absorbing beyond that 100%. Everybody follow that thought process? So this is one we have in our office. In our office, sometimes we just fill it with air, and we just use the benefits of air-pressured hyperbaric. Sometimes we pump in oxygen in addition to that. There are also soft chambers. Like I said, they're considered mild hyperbaric. They're not capable of the same pressure. You're not pumping in 100% oxygen here at all. You're typically either just using room air, or you can get an oxygen concentrator, which is capable of about 96 to 98% oxygen, and you could pump in some extra oxygen that way. Generally speaking, chambers that are filled with 100% oxygen are very expensive. There's a tremendous amount of regulation. There's a tremendous amount of control in terms of what clothing you could wear, what you could bring inside or not. Because literally, you're taking a tank of oxygen and you're filling a tank of oxygen. So while you're in there, you can't have any sparks or electronics or anything like that, right? Because oxygen is an accelerant for fire. The one in the middle, you could still get a very similar benefit, really basically the same benefit, but you're filling that chamber with air instead of oxygen. And then if you want, you could pump in 100% O2 so that you're really mimicking a very similar effect to the one on the right, but in a much safer, much less expensive, much less controlled, much less regulated type of scenario where it becomes very easy for practitioners like you and I to actually incorporate something like this into our practice. Even easier, even less expensive, even more available, equally effective are soft chambers. And soft chambers have the ability to also pressurize, still pump in some excess oxygen, still get amazing results, but at even a lower cost and a lower risk to the people or the clinic. So, these are basically what's available currently today. What are some of the benefits, long and short term, of hyperbaric oxygen? Short-term benefits include things like increased superoxide dismutase, balance of our balance of oxidation and reactive oxygen species. Vasoconstrictions. In certain cases, especially certain traumas, we don't mind a little vasoconstriction because we want to decrease how leaky those vessels are. But even with some vasoconstriction, you're massively increasing the amount of oxygen that's getting to the tissue. You have increased rate of oxidative phosphorylation, decreased inflammation, decreased hypoxia, increased tissue perfusion. More amazing, in my opinion, is the long-term benefits. Angiogenesis, we're building a new blood supply to certain tissues. Balance in the immune system, right? Most of our bacteria, the probiotics, the microbiome we want, are aerobic. Most of our pathogens are anaerobic. And so in an excessively aerobic environment, in a high oxygen environment, we're actually feeding the good bacteria exactly what they need, and at the same time helping to kill the bacteria that we don't. We have epigenetic expression. If you heard Dr. Harsh's talk yesterday, he talked about 8,101 genes that we already know are very oxygen sensitive, and we're switching these genes on and off by using pressurized oxygen. There's also enormous stem cell release. That stem cell release happens in the bone marrow, and that stem cell release happens in our central nervous system. So all of a sudden, we can start sending out our own intrinsic stem cells strictly from oxygenation. And so I just wanted to draw this conclusion very simply for everybody in here. But I initially started talking about the causes of these chronic illnesses, chronic stress, right? And so the result of chronic stress was decreased blood flow, increased inflammation, metabolic dysregulation, immune dysregulation, increased oxidative stress, right? Damage to the epigenome and the DNA, and ultimately leading to tissue breakdown. And if you looked at the long-term effects of hyperbaric oxygen, it's the exact opposite. Increased perfusion, decreased inflammation, metabolic regulation, immune system regulation, decreased oxidative stress, DNA and epigenetic repair, and then ultimately tissue repair. I will answer that in a few minutes. He said, how many hours do you need to really get those benefits? I'll go over that in a minute. So what are some of the clinical uses? You know, in that first hospital setting, they're treating pretty intense diseases. Gangrene, osteomyelitis, radiation burns, okay? And in some cases, that type of environment, 100% O2 in a high pressurized environment, that's what you need for those kinds of issues. But my point is, oxygen is so simple. It's so fundamental to what our body needs to heal. It's so safe to deliver. Why would we wait until we have these extraordinarily difficult to treat conditions before we start using something that simple, that safe, and yet that effective? Some of the more investigational uses that we use in our office are things like this: a variety of autoimmunity, dementia, Alzheimer's, MS, ALS, autism, cancer, Lyme, irritable bowel, a variety of neuropathies. These are conditions that respond very favorably to increased oxygen environments. Going a step further, what else could we use it for? Why would we even wait until we had those conditions? Look at athletic performance, increased recovery, increased capacity for mitochondrial function, right? So increased oxidative phosphorylation, increased mitochondrial density, improved performance. On the wellness side, just generally reduced inflammation, improved circulation. You know, aging is wound. The aging process are chronic wounds, small ones, that build up and are cumulative over our lifespan. Why don't we try to heal those wounds as they're happening? Give our body the fuel that it needs throughout the entire aging process in order to have the effect, that anti-aging, that regenerative effect on our system. We don't typically use these things alone. In my office, we do functional neurology, we do functional medicine. In your office, you might do fasting, or peptide therapies, or hormone therapies. You might use IV therapies. Hyperbaric oxygen is a tool. It's an amazing tool. It covers in a very wide variety of conditions and age brackets, but it's used best in combination with the things you're already doing. It's just giving the body the fuel that it needs to make whatever else you're doing even more powerful.